Deep within the annals of history, rising from the ancient waters of the Mediterranean, a city emerges, a city whose strength comes from the sea and whose wealth is built on trade, destined to one day challenge Rome itself. Yes, I'm talking about Carthage, but friends, this wasn't just any ordinary city. Carthage, at the heart of vital trade routes, was a power that ruled the Mediterranean with its might. Yet its story isn't just filled with victories, it holds great losses, forgotten wars, and ultimately the tragic downfall of an entire people. And from among them, one name is echoed through the ages: Hannibal Barca. The commander who brought Rome to its knees, who crossed mountains with elephants, driven by an unrelenting thirst for revenge. His story is one that hasn't been forgotten, even today. Hannibal's courage would breathe life back into the lost empire of Carthage. Now we'll bring you the rise and fall of this incredible civilization, dusting off the pages of history to reveal it once more. If you're ready, let me take you to the streets of Carthage, to the winds of the Mediterranean, and into the bloodiest battles of history. This is the story of Carthage's lost empire. Let's begin. My dear friends, let's dive into the dark corridors of history and discover how Carthage became a powerful center of strength. Once upon a time, brave traders set sail from the eastern Mediterranean, from Phoenicia, in search of new horizons. With the salty sea breeze filling their lungs, they sought more wealth and more land. For centuries, they expanded their trade networks and built port cities. And one day, on the fertile shores of North Africa, in what is now Tunisia, the foundations of Carthage were laid. The Phoenicians were the master sailors and traders of their time. They knew the sea routes as if they were land roads. With their trade networks stretching across the ancient world, they not only carried goods but also culture. Carthage began to flourish on this great heritage. But Carthage wasn't going to be just another port city. No, my friends, the city was destined for something far greater. While the Phoenicians placed Carthage like a jewel at the heart of the Mediterranean, they may not have realized the full potential this city held, but history had already begun to be written. Carthage's strategic location quickly made it the crossroads of Mediterranean trade routes. Just imagine a city controlling the grand trade networks of the ancient world. Gold, silver, spices, exotic goods, none passed without stopping at Carthage. And this wealth didn't just bring money and luxury, it brought the city power, influence, and respect. But with that power came the gaze of rivals. It was the golden age of trade, and Carthage was its rising star. Slowly but surely it began to find its own identity, stepping beyond the Phoenician legacy. This city would soon see itself not just as a trading hub, but as the first maritime empire. Friends, Carthage's rise was no accident. The desire to dominate the seas pushed them to build a vast fleet and strengthen their ties with colonies spread across the Mediterranean. Crete, Spain, Sardinia, and many other islands came under Carthaginian influence. And so, gradually, Carthage's strength was measured not just by its trade, but by its absolute dominance of the seas. This was the beginning of its transformation from a city-state to a maritime empire. Every port, every colony, added a new link to Carthage's chain of power. However, my friends, every rise comes at a cost. As Carthage's power grew, so did its enemies. Jealous eyes watched its wealth and dominance over the seas. It was at this point that Carthage's path would slowly cross with Rome. One day, these two giants would face off for control of the Mediterranean. But that day had not yet come. For now, let us marvel at Carthage's rise and ponder how this ancient city built its maritime empire. But dear friends, before we delve into the secrets behind this rise, before we understand how this mighty people built an empire, we must also grasp how Carthage became Rome's greatest enemy. Carthage's strength wasn't just in its fleet, but in the trader and warrior spirit of its people. So how did this great people one day face the danger of being wiped from the pages of history? The answers to these questions await us in the chapters to come. My dear friends, now it's time to tell the story of how Carthage transformed into a mighty empire through its mastery of trade. This civilization became powerful not just on the battlefield, but also by mastering the delicate art of commerce. Carthage's wealth and dominance in the Mediterranean were shaped not only by the goods displayed in its ports, but also by the sharp strategies that lay behind every wave. The descendants of the Phoenicians, These people spoke the language of the sea, and the Mediterranean was their grand stage. Every day, countless ships would dock at the ports of Carthage. From Egyptian grains to Indian spices, from the olive oil of Mediterranean islands, all kinds of goods came together in these bustling harbors. Ah, can you imagine the noise of those ports? Merchants haggling feverishly, ship captains checking which way the wind was blowing, the sails filling with a breeze. The port of Carthage was like the center of the world. And this center didn't just mean wealth, it meant power. Because Carthage's riches made it the most important trade hub in the Mediterranean. But they didn't just grow rich, my friends. Carthage built a formidable navy to protect and expand this trade. They understood that the seas weren't just trade routes, they were battlefields. A powerful navy ensured the safety of trade and acted as a shield, striking fear into the hearts of rival powers across the Mediterranean. In every port, in every bay, Carthage's strength could be felt. The flag of Carthage waving from the decks of its ships brought peace to its friends and terror to its enemies. This navy wasn't just a symbol of trade, but of military supremacy. Carthaginian sailors were masters of both commerce and war, and their strategic brilliance kept them one step ahead on the seas. And what about the Iberian Peninsula? Ah, my friends, this is where Carthage's ambitions truly peaked. The lands of Iberia were rich with valuable minerals and resources. Gold, silver, and copper, the treasures that fueled the dreams of Carthaginian merchants. Carthage knew that controlling these precious resources would solidify their dominance over the trade routes. So, they began to establish strong colonies along the shores of Iberia. Every port, every fortress further strengthened Carthage's control over the western Mediterranean. As the Carthaginian flag flew over Iberia, the balance of power in the Mediterranean began to shift. By this point, the western Mediterranean was almost like an internal sea for Carthage. Their influence could be seen on every island and every port. Sardinia, Corsica, the Balearic Islands, these strategic locations served both as trade hubs and military bases. Carthaginian merchants distributed the wealth of Iberia, its minerals, spices, and other riches across the Mediterranean through these islands. Wealth and power raced ahead together. Every trade deal, every ship voyage carried Carthage's influence even further. But my friends, remember that with every great success comes great responsibility. As Carthage grew in wealth and military strength, other powers in the Mediterranean began to take notice. Rome wasn't happy with Carthage's rapid rise. This great power in the western Mediterranean now posed a serious threat to Rome. These two mighty empires were slowly but surely moving towards each other, vying for control of the Mediterranean. Carthage may have been the master of trade routes, ruling the seas and enriching itself in Iberia. But the cost of this great success would be heavy. The calm waters of the Mediterranean were about to become the stage for a colossal clash between two giants. Carthage and Rome both wanted to dominate the Mediterranean, but the Mediterranean could only submit to one. My dear friends, the rise of Carthage's trading empire was truly something to behold. But the bells of fate had already begun to toll. Rome's eyes were on Carthage's wealth, its navy, and its influence in the Mediterranean. Carthage's naval superiority had given it an edge, but this story is far from over. Ah, Carthage and Rome. The moments when these two great civilizations clashed marked the beginning of a spark that would forever change the fate of the Mediterranean. As I tell you about this time, picture it in your mind, dear listeners, the rise of Rome and the maritime power of Carthage. These two forces were about to face off for the first time in the vast waters of the Mediterranean. Their first encounter was perhaps the beginning of an inevitable end. Carthage had been the dominant power in maritime trade. Its ports were bustling with ships. The Romans, on the other hand, were experienced in land warfare, but had almost no knowledge of naval battles. But then there was Sicily. Ah, that rich island. It was here that these two great powers would face off for the first time over control of Sicily. By 264 BC, the paths of Rome and Carthage crossed, but this was no friendly meeting. Sicily shone like a strategic jewel in the middle of the Mediterranean, and whoever controlled it would also dominate the seas. So what led to this showdown between these two powers? Here's the story. At that time, a local conflict had erupted around the city of Messina in Sicily. This conflict caught the attention of the Romans, and the people of Messina requested help from Rome. The Romans were quick to respond to their allies, but this move threatened Carthage's interests as well. Carthage had long used Sicily as a trading base. Allowing Rome to establish a foothold in Sicily would be a threat to Carthage's dominance in the Mediterranean, and thus the First Punic War broke out. Right from the start of the war, Carthage gained a significant advantage thanks to its superiority at sea. Carthaginian ships sliced through the waves of the Mediterranean, putting the Romans in tough spots. The Romans were inexperienced in naval battles. But here's one of the most remarkable things about the Romans: they were determined. To stand up to Carthage's navy, they built a fleet from scratch. Can you believe it? They captured a Carthaginian ship and quickly copied it to create a powerful fleet. The Romans didn't just stop at building a navy, they added a mechanism called the corvus to their warships, which turned naval battles into something more like land battles. The corvus acted like a bridge, allowing Roman soldiers to board enemy ships and fight hand-to-hand. This clever tactic gave the Romans an edge against the more experienced Carthaginians in naval warfare. Years of war ensued. It was a struggle filled with blood and tears. This war, which started in 264 BC, lasted a full 23 years. Every inch of Sicily was drenched in blood, with heavy losses on both sides. While Carthage had the upper hand in naval battles, the determination of the Romans meant that this advantage didn't last long. By the end of the First Punic War, Rome had managed to overpower Carthage at sea. Finally, in 241 BC, Carthage surrendered. The peace terms were harsh. Carthage completely lost Sicily and had to acknowledge Rome's dominance there. But this wasn't just about losing territory, dear friends. After the war, Carthage fell into significant economic hardship. Losing that territory was not just a matter of pride, it was the foundation of their economic power. Sicily was vital for agriculture and trade. Therefore, losing that island drained Carthage's treasury and left the city drowning in debt. On top of that, they had to pay war reparations to Rome, putting them in an even tougher spot. And so the long-standing enmity between Carthage and Rome began with this first major clash over the lands of Sicily. Carthage had lost this battle, but that didn't mean it was the end. Ah, my friends, Carthage's true strength had yet to fully reveal itself. Because far away, a much greater storm was brewing. That storm's name was Hannibal. Ah, Hannibal Barca. A name that was eager to step onto the stage of history, one that carved its destiny in the waves of the Mediterranean. His story is a saga that gives spirit to Carthage's resistance, my dear friends. When you hear Hannibal's name, don't just think of great victories, magnificent armies, and a genius who made the Romans tremble. No, his story runs much deeper, rooted in a family legacy, the teachings of his father Hannibal Barca, and the suffering that Carthage endured. When you step into this tale, you'll witness the rise of a leader who bore the fate of his people on his shoulders, not just a soldier. Hannibal's story began to take shape when he was just a child. His father, Hannibal Barca, was perhaps one of the most important military leaders of Carthage. Hannibal fought tooth and nail to protect Carthage during the First Punic War, engaging in fierce battles against the Romans in Sicily. Though Carthage lost Sicily in the end, Hamilcar had a new plan for Carthage Iberia. This land was rich with resources and would be a place for Carthage to start anew. Hamilcar took his family with him as he set out to rebuild Carthage's power in this new world. It was during these conquests that Hannibal was shaped. He was still just a little kid, but he grew up watching the battlefields alongside his father. Hamilcar didn't raise Hannibal as an ordinary child. He taught him about the honor of Carthage, the anger towards the Romans, and what needed to be done for Carthage to rise again. According to legend, Hamilcar made Hannibal place his hand on a sacred altar and swore an everlasting hatred towards Rome. This oath was a turning point in Hannibal's life and destiny. He was still very young, but he dreamed of the days he would fight for the future of Carthage. While Hamilcar was conquering Iberia for Carthage, Hannibal grew up in the shadow of these victories. The lands of Iberia were crucial for Carthage to regain its power. Hamilcar was capturing cities here and directing the wealth from rich mineral deposits back to Carthage, preparing for a new war against Rome. But Hamilcar didn't live long enough to see his plans through. Iberia became his final stop. With his death, the burden fell heavily on Hannibal's family, but it was clear who would take on this responsibility: Hannibal. After Hamilcar's death, Hannibal's brother Hasdrubal briefly took over leadership. However, he too met his end due to an assassination. And in that moment, Hannibal Barca took command of the Carthaginian army, not yet even 30 years old. With his father's legacy on one side and that unending rage against Rome on the other, Hannibal had now become the hope of Carthage. The people of Carthage saw him not just as a commander but as a savior. He continued his father's conquests in Iberia, strengthened his army, and carried that burning hatred for Rome in his heart. But Hannibal's true genius lay not just in the battlefield, but in his strategic thinking. He knew that Rome underestimated Carthage. They thought Carthage would never challenge them again. However, Hannibal was planning to strike at Rome right in their home. He was preparing to launch one of history's greatest campaigns by crossing the snowy peaks of the Alps and descending into the heart of Italy. And so Hannibal's rise was synonymous with the rebirth of Carthage. Every step he took was a continuation of the legacy left by his father, Hamilcar. The army he gathered in Iberia was not just made up of warrior soldiers. It symbolized the honor that Hannibal aimed to reclaim for Carthage and the vengeance he would unleash against Rome. On this path, Hannibal was not merely after military victories. He wanted to bring Rome to its knees and etch Carthage's name into history. In the next section, we'll dive into Hannibal's epic campaign against Rome after crossing the Alps. Get ready, dear listeners, because you're about to witness one of history's greatest military strategies. The Second Punic War. This epic struggle changed the course of history and marked the moment when Hannibal's genius and bravery took center stage as Carthage rose up against Rome one last time. But Hannibal's challenge to Rome wasn't just any challenge, it was truly a battle for destiny. The spark that ignited everything happened in a small town in Iberia, the siege of Saguntum. Saguntum was a little Iberian city under Rome's protection. After Hannibal's father Hamilcar, Carthage had gained strength in Iberia and expanded its dominance in the region. Rome was worried about these developments. While Hannibal was boosting Carthage's influence in Iberia, Rome was determined not to let Carthage grow unchecked. This tension exploded into conflict with the siege of Saguntum. To Hannibal, Saguntum wasn't just a city, it was a direct challenge to Rome. He aimed to test Rome's strength and gauge their reaction to Carthage's rise. When Hannibal's army surrounded Saguntum, Rome found itself in a bind. With the city struggling under siege, calls for help went out to Rome. However, the political situation in Rome left them paralyzed for a while, and Hannibal seized the opportunity. Once the city finally fell into his hands, the tension between Rome and Carthage had turned into full-blown war. Rome found Hannibal's move unacceptable. Diplomatic efforts failed, and finally the spark for the Second Punic War was ignited at the walls of Saguntum. But Hannibal wasn't just a leader content with capturing a city, he was preparing a bold plan to take the fight straight to Rome's heart. That plan was to cross the Alps and invade Roman territory. The Alps, these cold, rugged, and almost impassable mountains were a huge asset in Hannibal's mind against Rome. No one could have predicted such courage, especially the Romans. They thought Hannibal would come from the sea or directly from Carthage. Instead, he decided to shock everyone by making his way over the Alps into Italy. This decision would go down as one of the most audacious military moves in history. Hannibal's army consisted of warriors, allies, and perhaps most famously, elephants. Oh yes, I need to mention the elephants. These massive creatures had become a symbol of Hannibal's army. When Hannibal decided to lead his elephants through the harsh alpine passes, it was more than just a tactic, it was a display of courage. It sent a message to Rome: I can reach you from anywhere. As Hannibal and his army progressed through those snowy, icy passes, they faced not just the enemy but the ruthless elements of nature as well. Legends say that the freezing winds chilled the soldiers to the bone as they struggled along the snow-covered mountain paths. The elephants provided both morale for the Carthaginian troops and a surprise that the Romans could never have anticipated. These elephants symbolized Carthage's strength and Hannibal's determination. As they moved through the icy peaks of the Alps, Hannibal's challenge to Rome was slowly becoming a reality. This legendary Alpine crossing was not just a military maneuver. Hannibal's decision also hit the Romans psychologically. Crossing the Alps was a move they never would have expected. And with this unexpected strategy, Hannibal threw Rome's preparations into chaos. When his army finally emerged from the Alps, they were not just entering Roman territory, they were bringing the first signs of a victory that could be achieved over Rome. Hannibal's march over the Alps to Rome is remembered as one of the greatest military achievements in history. This legendary crossing showcased Hannibal's courage and leadership abilities. Rome could no longer underestimate Hannibal's power. This Carthaginian army, coming down from the snowy peaks of the Alps, was at Rome's doorstep, and war was inevitable. But the real battle had yet to begin, my dear friends. Hannibal hadn't yet secured those great victories that would shake Rome to its core. Ahead of us lie the major battles Hannibal would wage on Roman soil, moments where the Romans faced defeat, and unforgettable instances of Carthage's resurgence. I can't wait to tell you about those epic battles where Hannibal brought the Romans to their knees. Ah, my friends, we've reached those great victories that etched Hannibal's name in the history books in gold letters. Rome had never encountered a foe as determined, clever, and ruthless as Hannibal. He was about to unleash battles that would instill fear in the heart of Rome. These victories not only showcased Carthage's military genius but also revealed how Hannibal moved on the battlefield like a chess master. Now let me tell you about those epic battles where the Carthaginian army brought Rome to its knees. First, let's go back to the Battle of the Trebia River. This battle is known as Carthage's first major victory against Rome. It was the year 218 BC, just months after Hannibal had crossed the Alps. The Roman army intended to stop Hannibal, but they underestimated his intelligence. The Roman commanders thought they could ambush the Carthaginians, believing they would be forced to cross the river. But Hannibal had already figured out their strategy. When the Roman army stepped into the icy waters of the Trebia River, Hannibal's plan sprang into action. Hannibal had effectively surrounded the Roman army with forces he had secretly placed along the banks of the Trebia River. As the freezing Romans crossed the river, Carthaginian cavalry and elephants charged the left flank of the Romans. The ambushed Roman troops were thrown into disarray. The Roman army was defeated by Hannibal's flawless tactic, and the cries of victory echoed around the Trebia as Carthage celebrated. Hannibal had once again proven what a dangerous enemy he was to Rome. But my friends, for Hannibal, the Trebia was just the beginning. The following year, in 217 BC, the Roman army would kneel before Hannibal once again. This time it would be along the shores of Lake Trasimene. The Battle of Lake Trasimene. Hannibal had crafted this battle like a master hunter. Roman commander Gaius Flaminius, while pursuing Hannibal, never suspected he would set an ambush by the lake. As Hannibal's forces waited in the narrow passes around Lake Trasimene, the Roman army unwittingly marched into the trap. In the early light of dawn, as the Roman troops entered the pass by the lake, they were suddenly attacked by the surrounding Carthaginian forces. That morning, the horror of battle was immense along the shores. The Romans could find neither a way to escape nor a line of defense. With yet another masterful tactic, Hannibal nearly annihilated the Roman army. Once again, Rome was shaken by a great defeat. The waters of Lake Trasimene were mixed with the blood of Roman soldiers that day. However, my friends, the real victory, the true epic tale, had yet to be written. Hannibal's greatest blow to Rome would come at Cannae. By 216 BC, Rome was determined to put everything on the line to stop Hannibal. The Roman Senate assembled a massive army around 80,000 soldiers, one of Rome's largest armies, hoped to finally put an end to Hannibal. But Hannibal would turn their ambition to his advantage. At Cannae, Rome's arrogance would be their downfall. The Battle of Cannae is perhaps considered the greatest tactical masterpiece in military history. Hannibal was about to ensnare the Roman army like a spider's web. When the battle began, Hannibal feigned weakness at the center of his army and fell back. The Romans interpreted this maneuver as a sign of victory and became even more aggressive. But that was exactly what Hannibal wanted. As the Roman army pressed forward towards Hannibal's center, the wings of Carthage began to encircle Rome. Hannibal's cavalry closed in from the rear, and suddenly the Roman army found itself trapped. At Cannae, Rome's enormous army fell into Hannibal's strategic trap. On that day, the Roman army was utterly destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of Roman soldiers were either killed or taken prisoner. Rome had experienced its greatest defeat in history. The Battle of Cannae was a moment that elevated Hannibal's military genius to its peak and demonstrated the Romans' helplessness against him. These victories of Hannibal were not just military successes against Rome, they were moments that restored Carthage's pride and power. But sadly, every great victory comes at a price, my friends. While Hannibal's brilliant victories signaled hopeful days for Carthage, the shadow of dark years began to loom ahead. Rome was not going to surrender easily. They would develop new strategies against Hannibal. But on that day, the great day of Cannae, Hannibal had triumphed. After Cannae, Rome would take a deep breath and engage in a tough struggle to regroup. Ahead of Hannibal lay even tougher battles and greater challenges. Ah, my friends, the fire of war continued to burn between Rome and Carthage for years. Hannibal had reached the peak of victory at Cannae, but the war was far from over. Even though Rome seemed to be on its knees after that major defeat, it hadn't actually been defeated yet. This ancient city was gathering strength and starting to change its strategies to rise again. And Hannibal's greatest victory would also mark the beginning of his toughest times. Let me take you through Rome's resistance and Carthage's gradual decline. Despite the heavy defeat at Cannae, Rome never lost its courage or determination. The Roman Senate realized they couldn't directly defeat Hannibal on the battlefield, so they turned to that famous strategy of attrition warfare. My friends, this strategy would slowly start to wear Hannibal down. The Romans, now too scared to confront Hannibal directly, began to use subtle and patient methods to cut off his supply lines and provoke cities that weren't providing him with logistical support. Hannibal's long campaign in Italy, while showcasing his genius, was also draining Carthage's military and economic resources. He had spent years on Italian soil but never found the opportunity to seize Rome. Victory was so close yet so far away. Rome managed to counter Hannibal's clever maneuvers each time. The Roman commander Fabius Maximus's attrition strategy narrowed Hannibal's options and boxed him into the war. Despite winning great victories, Hannibal just couldn't reach the gates of Rome. As time passed, Hannibal's army and supplies began to dwindle. Rome was increasing the pressure by exploiting this dilemma. And this, my friends, is where Carthage's weakening began. Hannibal might have been an amazing commander, but his success depended not just on the battlefield but also on support from Carthage. Back then, Carthage was struggling with internal issues and weakening due to political conflicts. These disputes and economic difficulties prevented Carthage from providing Hannibal with adequate support. He had come so close to conquering Rome, but just at this critical moment, Carthage's situation was starting to weaken. Carthage could no longer finance the war for long. This great struggle against Rome had clogged Carthage's trade routes and drained its resources. The city-state was becoming too weak to support Hannibal's monumental victories. Economic troubles were making Carthage increasingly vulnerable. The major income sources from trade cities were closing one by one, and support from colonies in Iberia was being cut off. Hannibal was still fighting on Italian soil, but time was working against him. Instead of aggressively pursuing Hannibal, Rome succeeded in wearing him down with patience. The victorious years for Hannibal turned into a long and endless war of attrition. As Rome grew stronger day by day, Carthage and Hannibal's forces were dwindling. Hannibal's elephants had decreased in number, and most of his army had been lost in battles. After the victorious Cannae, Hannibal's epic journey in Italy was slowly reaching a dead end. And so, my friends, Rome's stubborn resistance made Hannibal's struggle increasingly difficult. Carthage's decline would become one of the turning points of the war. Rome hadn't given up. On the contrary, they had essentially restarted the fight. But this time it was a different strategy, a war of patience and waiting. Ah, dear listeners, as Hannibal's days of triumph faded into the past, Carthage was being crushed under the exhausting effects of this prolonged war. But remember, the end of this war has not yet been written. Rome was preparing to launch a major counter-offensive against Hannibal. Ah, my dear friends, history is a journey filled with victories, but sometimes, behind the greatest triumphs, there are unavoidable defeats waiting to be revealed. Now let me take you on a journey toward the end of Hannibal's legendary struggles, the Battle of Zama. That famous battlefield that marks the beginning of the end for Carthage. But I can't skip over how we got to this point. The year is 202 BC. After Hannibal had spent many long years in Italy, Rome finally found a commander who could counter his strategy. Publius Cornelius Scipio, who would later be known as Scipio Africanus, would become Rome's savior. This young and talented general had learned Hannibal's battle tactics and understood his genius. Scipio was the one who initiated the counterattack following Rome's strategy of attrition. But this battle would take place not on Italian soil but in the heart of Africa, Carthage's homeland. Scipio's strategy was to strike Carthage at home and force Hannibal to return. Ah, Hannibal! He had come so close to conquering Italy with his warrior spirit, but unfortunately, this move by Rome threw his plans into chaos. Years later, Hannibal left Italy and returned home to Carthage. But upon his return, he found an army marching into Africa with the full strength of Rome behind it. Scipio had landed in Africa and posed a significant threat to Carthage. Hannibal had to respond with a tired and weakened army. The days when he raced from victory to victory were behind him, but he hadn't lost any of that courageous spirit. The two armies met at a place called Zama. The Battle of Zama would perhaps be Hannibal's toughest test. While Scipio managed the Roman army with perfect discipline, Hannibal entered the fray carrying the weariness of many years on his shoulders. Oh, my friends, you should have seen how Hannibal rallied his troops during those fierce moments of battle, giving them hope. But this time, Rome's plan was superior. Scipio had deciphered Hannibal's famous tactics and managed to neutralize the war elephants he used. Back then, the fearsome power of elephants on the battlefield was legendary, but Scipio's disciplined infantry lines managed to stop these giant creatures. Despite all of Hannibal's brilliance, the fate of the Battle of Zama turned in favor of Rome's disciplined army. Hannibal showcased all his skills on the battlefield one last time, but unfortunately the outcome wasn't what he had hoped for. The Roman army defeated the Carthaginian forces. Zama became perhaps the most painful defeat in Hannibal's life. Rome's young general, Scipio Africanus, etched his name into history with this victory. And so, my friends, the Battle of Zama was not just a fight, it symbolized the closing of an era. With this defeat, Hannibal had to surrender Carthage to Rome. Thus, the Second Punic War came to an end. Once, Hannibal was a leader who struck fear into the heart of Rome. But now, Carthage would fall under Roman control, with only memories left of its former glory. But remember, my friends, Hannibal never gave up. Carthage may have surrendered, but Hannibal never surrendered his spirit. He may have lost at Zama, but there was no victory or defeat that could erase his name from history. Hannibal's genius, strategic brilliance, and courage will continue to be told for centuries. While Zama may seem like an end, it actually became an everlasting part of the Hannibal legend. And so, my friends, the struggle of Carthage against Rome came to a close. However, these battles were not just military conflicts, they were a chain of events that changed the fate of a nation. Hannibal's heroics, the rise and fall of Carthage, are among the greatest epic tales in history, and this story will continue to live on in memory forever. My dear friends, after Hannibal's defeat at Zama, it wouldn't be hard for anyone to think that Carthage's great power was now fading. That magnificent city had built the most powerful trade empire in the Mediterranean, but now it struggled to survive under the shadow of Rome. Yet the people of Carthage never lost their proud and resilient spirit. Yes, after Zama, Rome had brought Carthage to its knees, but the fire within this city had not yet been extinguished. Carthage was determined to do everything it could to rise again. Carthage appeared to have bowed down with the peace treaty it signed with Rome. But my friends, the terms that Rome imposed on Carthage back then were quite harsh. Carthage was tied down both economically and militarily. Rome had set conditions aimed at completely controlling Carthage, determined not to let its old enemy regain strength. Carthage had to pay heavy reparations every year, and it wasn't allowed to build a large army. Still, the people of Carthage found ways to survive even in this cornered city. They began to regain strength through trade and industry. The people were starting to become wealthy again and regain their hopes. My friends, during those days, while the people of Carthage seemed to silently submit to Rome's pressures with their strong spirit of resistance, they actually dreamed of becoming a great power once more. Behind the city walls, the seeds of rebirth were beginning to sprout. However, this revival wouldn't go unnoticed by Rome. Rome was watching every move of Carthage. As that great city began to stir in its efforts to rise again, Rome's patience started to wear thin. Rome felt that the time had come to completely destroy Carthage once more. And that's how the Third Punic War began, my friends. The year was 149 BC. Rome was preparing to deal the final blow to Carthage. But this time the war was different from the two major conflicts that had come before, because Rome now wanted to completely eliminate Carthage. The Roman Senate issued a heavy ultimatum to Carthage. They were to abandon the city and move inland. This was like a death sentence for Carthage. The people of Carthage chose to fight rather than leave the land where their ancestors had lived. For them, these lands were filled with memories of the past. Leaving their ports, markets, and sacred places meant abandoning their honor. My dear friends, the brave people of Carthage rose up against Rome once more. They used whatever they had left to defend against Rome. Their weapons were few and their army was weak. But this people was determined to resist to the end. This last great war, which lasted 3 years, was practically Carthage's final breath. The Roman armies besieged the city, and hunger and poverty took hold of Carthage. But the city did not surrender. In 146 BC, Rome broke down the walls of Carthage, and entered the city. That day marked the complete end of Carthage's presence in the Mediterranean. That magnificent city was reduced to rubble by Rome's command. The people, struggling with hunger in the streets, tried to resist Rome's ruthlessness, but the city ultimately fell. Carthage was now erased from the stage of history. Buildings were destroyed, the land was salted, and the people of the city were either slaughtered or sold into slavery. Rome did not want another rival like Carthage to rise again. The Third Punic War ended in a complete victory for Rome, but this victory meant not just success for Rome, but the destruction of Carthage. And so, my friends, the story of Carthage ultimately turned to ashes. But this great city was not forgotten in the pages of history. As the center of trade and civilization, it left deep marks in human history. Rome may have won the victory, but the brave people of Carthage and their great commanders, from Hannibal to Hamilcar, will always be remembered for their heroic struggles. Carthage was once one of the brightest stars of the Mediterranean, and that star will continue to shine in our memories forever. Ah, my dear friends, history always teaches us something. The fall of Carthage reminds us that even great empires can one day fade into history. But these destructions always sow the seeds of new rebirths. Carthage displayed one of the greatest resistances in history, and the legend of that resistance will be told for centuries to come. Ah, my friends, we have now come to the final moments of Carthage. Rome had brought Carthage to its knees and shattered its resistance. But this war was about so much more than just a military victory. Rome wasn't satisfied with merely defeating Carthage. It was determined to completely annihilate this great city and bury it deep in the annals of history. This was more about erasing the existence of another empire than about the triumph of one. By 146 BC, the walls of Carthage had begun to crumble under the brutal Roman siege. Under the command of Scipio Aemilianus, Rome systematically took down Carthage's last strongholds. After 3 years of siege and unending battles, Carthage's strength had been entirely drained. But the Carthaginians, my dear friends, fought on until the very end. They were fighting for their freedom, for their homes, families, and honor. Their struggle wasn't just about the interests of an empire, it was a fight for survival. Eventually, Rome breached Carthage's walls and entered the city. And at that moment, my dear friends, the brilliant star of the Mediterranean was plunged into an eternal darkness. The city fell victim to the plundering of Roman soldiers. Hunger and destruction ruled the streets of Carthage. Every corner, every street witnessed the moments marking the end of this great city in history. Its legendary ports, trading centers, magnificent temples, and palaces were laid to waste by Roman hands. Carthage's role on the historical stage ended here, ruthlessly. Rome had attacked Carthage with such determination that they didn't want this city to ever rise again. That's why after the fall of Carthage, there were not only heaps of stones left but also legends. It is said that the Romans not only destroyed Carthage but also salted its earth to make it infertile for farming again. Ah, my dear friends, this might be a bit of an exaggeration, as the accuracy of this legend is still debated among historians. But one thing is certain: Rome wanted to destroy Carthage in a way that served as a warning to the world. This legend became a symbol of that determination to erase it. Even though Carthage's lands had turned into barren wastelands, my dear friends, Rome's victory wasn't just about the destruction of a city. This victory was a declaration of Rome's complete dominance in the Mediterranean. Those waters once used for trade by Carthage's ships had now become a symbol of Rome's imperial power. From now on, the Mediterranean would be known as Mare Nostrum, meaning our sea, as the Romans declared. The destruction of Carthage was not just a victory for Rome, it was a turning point. Rome had now become the unquestioned master of the Western Mediterranean. Whatever was left of Carthage was adjusted to fit into Rome's new order. The surviving inhabitants of the city were enslaved or slaughtered. The last traces of Carthaginian culture in the Mediterranean began to vanish. The city would never regain its former strength and glory. Ah, my friends, after this destruction, other powers would rise in the Mediterranean. Other cities would emerge. But the fall of Carthage was an irreplaceable loss. Rome announced its victory to the entire world. Though Carthage has become just a part of the past, this story will be told throughout history. Even though Carthage fell, Its memory was never erased. The end of this great city also marked the end of an era in history. Rome's victory rose from the ashes of Carthage, but every empire has its day, and Rome will have an end as well. History is always filled with cycles, my dear friends, and every rise carries with it a fall. Ah, my dear friends, the brilliance of Hannibal Barca on the battlefield and the glory of Carthage in the Mediterranean shone like stars on the stage of history. But just like every star, Hannibal had his end. Now, as we sift through the ashes of Carthage, let's look at the final years of this great commander who once made Rome tremble, and the legacy he left behind. After his defeat at Zama, Hannibal returned to Carthage. The city tried to recover under his clever leadership, but even in Carthage, Hannibal couldn't find peace. As long as Rome knew he was alive, it wouldn't feel safe. Hannibal's only enemy wasn't just Rome. The internal struggles in politics in Carthage also became a thorn in his side. After the defeat, some blamed Hannibal, and among the people he had once elevated, certain circles in Carthage began to fear his power. The city started to see its once great hero as a threat. Alone amid the internal conflicts of the people he had once commanded, Hannibal found himself isolated. So, dear friends, Hannibal had no choice but to go into exile. No matter where he went, the shadow of Rome was always behind him. His years in exile felt like being tossed around like a ghost. First, he served the Seleucid kingdom in the eastern Mediterranean, looking for ways to fight against Rome. But fate once again left him under Roman pressure. Wherever he went, Roman envoys followed him. They didn't want him to pose any threat to Rome again. With each step, Roman spies watched him, and every ruler he thought was a friend was wary of Rome. Years passed and Hannibal grew old, but the fire in his heart never died out. Ultimately, to avoid falling into the hands of the enemies he had fought all his life, he took his own life. "When Rome captures me, I won't find peace even in my grave," Hannibal had said. And those words summarized his life. Carthage's great son, a general who traveled the world and shook empires, had closed his eyes to life as an exile. However, dear friends, Hannibal's death didn't mean the end of his legacy. Despite the fall of Carthage, the trade and cultural heritage of this civilization echoed throughout the Mediterranean. The Carthaginians were masters of trade and conquerors of the seas. They established trade colonies in every corner of the Mediterranean, weaving a network across the western part of the sea. The maritime knowledge of this Phoenician descended people influenced many civilizations, including Rome. Even though Carthage was destroyed, its cultural and commercial legacy continued to thrive through the relationships it had built. Carthaginian traders left indelible marks with the trade networks they established along the Mediterranean shores. Rome even benefited from these networks. In the waters that Carthage once controlled, Roman ships followed in the wake of the Carthaginians. Today, as we look at the remnants of Carthage in the modern world, we better understand the value this great civilization added to history. Their maritime expertise, combined with the cultural richness of the Phoenicians and their epic struggles against Rome, have earned them an unforgettable place in history. Hannibal's strategies are still taught in military schools centuries later, and his brilliance on the battlefield is studied even in modern military history. My dear friends, the fall of Carthage was certainly an end, but it was also a beginning. The demise of this great civilization served as a stepping stone for Rome's rise, yet Carthage's legacy echoed throughout the Mediterranean. Despite Rome's victory, the shadow of Hannibal did not fade away. Carthage may have been lost as a land, but its cultural and strategic heritage never vanished. So, dear friends, the end of Carthage intertwined with Hannibal's fate. But this is not the end of the story. The legacy of Carthage will always be remembered in world history. This legendary city of the Mediterranean may have fallen, but its memory will continue to live on in the hearts of humanity. Ah, my dear friends, we've reached the end of our journey together. From the glory of Carthage to the legend of Hannibal and the rise of Rome, we've delved deep into history at every turn, witnessing the conflicts and triumphs between civilizations. Today, as we bring together these great stories that teach us so much, we're reminded once again of how history can be a source of entertainment, lessons, and inspiration. The life of Carthage, my friends, was like a dagger thrust into the heart of an enemy. It was a threat to Rome and a curiosity for the Mediterranean. The story of this civilization was filled not only with wars, but also with trade, cultural exchanges, and ships gliding through the seas. Carthage was more than just a city-state. It was a vast trading empire, a master of the seas, and a people known for their strategy and intelligence. Hannibal's courage wasn't limited to just battle tactics. He was a leader who inspired his nation even in the most brutal moments of war. He tried to keep the spirit of Carthage alive through the trust others had in him. Hannibal should be remembered not just for his victories on the battlefield, but also for his determination in struggle. His defeat at Zama didn't end his story. Instead, it paved the way for a re-evaluation and understanding of Carthage and its legacy. As time went on, Carthage's ruins may have been lost to the salty sea waves, but its legacy and influence continued to shine like lights on the stage of history. As pioneers of trade, culture, and military strategy, the lessons of Carthage affected various civilizations throughout history. While Rome's victory may have marked an end, the story of Carthage will live on as an epic remembered for generations. My dear friends, this journey is not just a return to the past, it's also a gateway to understanding our present. As we learn about the history of Carthage, we also have the opportunity to question the values of our own culture and society. History not only helps us understand the past, but also holds up a mirror to the future. It's up to us to learn from past mistakes, celebrate successes, and carry this knowledge forward into our futures. So now let's sit around this fire of wisdom and think about what kind of legacy we want to leave in our lives, our society, and our culture. Remember, each of us is the hero of our own story, and as we follow the traces of the past, the responsibility to build our future rests on our shoulders. Valuable friends, I hope the information and stories I've shared during this journey have inspired you. May our desire to uncover the secrets of history never fade. Every civilization has something to teach us. And even though we've come to the end of this amazing journey, the flame of curiosity within us must not be extinguished. It's time to embark on a quest for new stories in the depths of history. I'm so glad to have accompanied you on these unique and magical journeys through time. I look forward to our next meeting, where we'll explore another story, another civilization. Farewell, my dear friends.